The Vindication tore through the void like a wounded beast, her hull scorched from near misses, her engines shrieking under the strain of the desperate jump. The ship buckled as it emerged from slip space, tumbling straight into the maelstrom of war. Serapis Prime was already burning. Eric Talon stood rigid on the bridge, his gloved fists gripping the console as data flooded the screens. The shattered remains of human cruisers drifted in the abyss, their wreckage peppering the battlefield like the bones of a forgotten species. Alien warships prowled the wreckage, their sleek, obsidian hulls reflecting the inferno below. "Status," Eric barked. Lieutenant Mara Quinn, her face smeared with oil and sweat, scanned the flickering readouts. "Shields at 40%, reactor holding. We've got a squadron of Scythe-class fighters moving in. Fast." Eric didn't flinch. "Weapons free. Let them come." Beyond the viewport, streaks of green plasma seared through space, lancing towards the Vindication. The ship's automated defenses whirred to life, spitting rapid-fire rounds that shredded the incoming fighters in a burst of metal and flame. "The Imperium fleet is closing," Mara continued, her voice tight. "Flagship Endbringer is locking weapons." A chill settled over the bridge. They all knew what that meant. The Endbringer was no ordinary warship. It was a message. A harbinger of annihilation. Over a mile long, plated in living obsidian, its surface pulsed with eerie blue veins that crackled with energy. Wherever it arrived, human resistance crumbled. Eric exhaled sharply. No hesitation. No fear. He flicked open a comm channel. "All hands prepare for full combat engagement." The crews sprang into motion. Officers barked orders, gunners prepped the rail cannons, and engineers rerouted power from auxiliary systems to reinforce their failing shields. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to make damn sure the Imperium remembered their names. Then the distress signal flared across their comms. "This is the colony transport Hope's Horizon. We're under attack. Civilians on board. Repeat, civilians on board. We won't make it." The transmission cut to static. Mara turned to Eric, her expression grim. "Sir, if we go after them, we'll be wide open to the Endbringer." Eric's gut twisted. The Hope's Horizon was already breaking apart under sustained fire from an Imperium cruiser, its hull venting atmosphere, hundreds of live seconds from extinction. A long pause. The bridge crew watched him, waiting. "We go," Eric said. He didn't explain. Didn't justify. There was no time, and there was no question. The Vindication surged forward, engines flaring as the ship ripped toward the transport, its railguns roaring. 2 precise shots cracked through the Imperium cruiser's shields, punching molten holes through its core. It lurched sideways, trying to recover, but the Vindication was already moving. "Firing torpedoes." Mara's hands danced over the console. 3 blue-glowing projectiles streaked through the void, slamming into the enemy vessel's reactor bay. The explosion consumed it in a violent supernova, sending debris tumbling through space. "Direct hit," Mara confirmed, voice taut. "The transport's still bleeding, but they can limp out." Eric barely had time to nod before alarms screamed across the bridge. "Incoming fire!" The helmsman yanked the controls, but it was too late. The Vindication lurched as a blast from the Endbringer's main cannon slammed into their aft section. Consoles exploded, sparks rained down, and crew members were hurled from their stations. Eric staggered against the impact, pain shooting up his ribs as he hit the deck. Blood dripped from a gash on his temple. The lights flickered. Smoke filled the air. "Damage report!" he roared. The voice that answered chilled him to the bone. "Commander Talon." The comm channel had been hijacked. High Warlord Zyrakon's voice slithered through the speakers, cold, calculating. "You never learn, do you? Always throwing yourselves onto the pyre, screaming defiance even as you burn." Eric clenched his jaw. "I'd rather burn than kneel." A chuckle. "And that is why your species is doomed." The Vindication trembled again, this time, not from enemy fire. Mara's eyes widened at her console. "Sir, our shields just dropped." "What?" Eric turned sharply. The answer came in the form of a second explosion inside the ship. Deck 4, Engineering Sector. An internal blast rocked the Vindication, rupturing bulkheads, setting fires raging through the corridors. "We have a breach! Sabotage! Someone disabled the internal dampeners before the blast!" a tech shouted over the chaos. Eric's mind raced. How? They had no prisoners, no recent boardings. That left only one explanation. A traitor. His comm unit crackled again. A new voice. "Commander." The voice was hesitant, raw with guilt. "I had no choice." Eric's blood ran cold. Lieutenant Vren. One of his own officers. "You son of a—" Mara started, but Eric cut her off. "Talk," he ordered. A shaky breath. "They have my family, Eric. The Imperium took them. I made a deal, your ship, in exchange for their lives." Eric closed his eyes for half a second. Then cold as steel. "And do you really think they'll keep their word?" Silence. Eric didn't wait for an answer. "Security team, find and contain him. Now." The ship trembled again. The Endbringer was circling for the kill. Eric turned back to his crew, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We're not dead yet. The reactor's compromised," Mara warned. "If we take another direct hit, then we don't let them take the shot," Eric snapped. His mind was already working. They were outmatched, outgunned, and falling apart. But there was still one move left on the board. A mad, desperate gambit. "Mara," he said. "We're going dark." Her eyes widened. "Sir, if we power down completely, we lose everything, engines, weapons." "They'll think we're dead," he cut in. "And when they get close enough—" Realization dawned. A grim, vicious smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "We make them regret it." Eric turned back toward the viewport, watching as the Endbringer loomed closer, the Imperium fleet tightening their grip. They thought they'd won. They thought humanity was broken. They had no idea what was coming. The Vindication went dark. Power drained from the hull, leaving the ship a drifting husk against the cold, star-streaked abyss. The reactor dimmed to a low, deceptive hum. Engines offline. Shields down. The bridge, once alive with the hum of war, sank into a tense, suffocating silence. Outside, the Endbringer prowled forward, its obsidian form swallowing the distant starlight. It wasn't firing. Not yet. The Imperium didn't waste ammunition on a corpse. Eric Talon stood motionless, watching the enemy through the viewport. The crew waited, breaths held, hearts pounding. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they were dead. Mara's voice cut through the stillness, barely above a whisper. "If they scan us, they'll see through this." "They won't," Eric murmured. His eyes stayed locked on the Endbringer, calculating. "They're not expecting a trick. They think we're beaten." "Are we?" Eric smirked, though his ribs ached from the earlier impact. "Not even close." The ship rocked subtly. A small collision. Debris from their own wreckage grazed their hull, a grim illusion reinforcing their deception. More fragments drifted by, the remnants of human vessels torn apart in the battle. The Imperium was efficient. They wiped out their enemies, catalogued their losses, and moved on. And that's exactly what Eric needed them to do. "Come closer," he muttered under his breath. "Come check for survivors." As if summoned, the Endbringer's flank shifted. Smaller escort ships peeled away, their glowing sensor arrays sweeping the battlefield, scanning for escape pods, lingering resistance, proof of life. Eric's fingers curled into fists. "Mara, be ready." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The tension in her jaw, the way her hand hovered over the manual override said enough. One shot. That's all they get. One moment to turn the hunter into the hunted. The traitor's gamble. A warning light flickered on Mara's console. "Incoming transmission," she said, barely masking her disgust. Eric exhaled through his nose. "Patch it through." The bridge speakers crackled, and then, Lieutenant Vren's voice. Weaker. More hesitant. "Commander." Eric's jaw tightened. You've got 5 seconds before I cut this feed. I know what I did, Brent said quickly. And I know what happens next. But you need to listen to me. The man sounded drained, the weight of his betrayal pressing against his words. But Eric didn't have time for guilt. Talk fast, Eric said coldly. The Endbringer isn't just here to wipe us out, Brent said. They have a boarding team ready. Their commandos are waiting for confirmation that our ship's disabled before moving in. They want you alive. Mara's head snapped toward Eric. They're taking prisoners? Eric didn't flinch. Of course they were. The Imperium didn't just want victory. They wanted to make an example of him. Break him. Parade his shattered body before the last human colonies. Not happening. How much time? Eric demanded. They'll move in 5 minutes, Brent said. Maybe less. Eric turned to Mara. How much juice can we get in the railguns? Her fingers flew over the controls, checking the drained reserves. Enough for a single burst. Maybe. It would have to do. Vren. Eric's voice was sharp. Where are you now? A pause. Containment. A sensible place for a traitor. But Eric wasn't done with him yet. You want to fix this? Eric asked, his voice cold. Get to the power core and reroute whatever's left into the main thrusters. Vren hesitated. Then, a quiet, resigned, understood. Eric ended the call and exhaled. Mara scoffed. You really trust him? I trust that he values his family, Eric said. And if he wants them to have a future, he'll do what I said. The trap is set. The escort ships drifted closer, scanning, probing, looking for movement. On the bridge, everything was still. Eric stood by the viewport, fingers tapping against the console. His mind worked through the last steps of the plan, the final calculations of risk and consequence. Then, the moment arrived. The Endbringer's escort ships signaled their command. The Imperium boarding pods launched, 4 of them, sleek black vessels cutting through space like spears. Wait for it, Eric murmured. The pods grew closer. Closer. Now. Fire! Eric roared. Mara slammed her hand onto the manual override. The Vindication came alive. Railguns thundered, streaks of white-hot tungsten lancing through the void. The boarding pods never had a chance. 3 of them exploded instantly, shattered into drifting slag. The 4th spun wildly, leaking atmosphere before slamming into a wrecked battleship. The escort ships reacted, but too slowly. The Vindication was already moving. Vren had done his part. The thrusters ignited, propelling them toward the Endbringer before the larger ship could process what was happening. Alarms shrieked. Imperium forces scrambled. The hunter had become the prey. Boarding the beast. The Endbringer's shields are too strong for direct fire, Mara shouted. We need a different approach. Eric's mind raced. Then we get inside. Mara blinked. What? The boarding pod that survived, redirect it. We ride it in. The helmsman, pale but steady, rerouted the course. The half-destroyed boarding vessel spun, its momentum carrying it straight toward the Endbringer's hangar bay. The bridge crew stared at Eric like he'd lost his mind. Sir? Mara said, voice tight. That's a suicide run. Eric met her gaze. Only if we hesitate. She exhaled sharply. Then let's not. The crew strapped in. The Vindication veered toward the boarding pod's trajectory, latching onto its side with docking clamps. The broken craft twisted, spun, and slammed into the Endbringer's open bay. Metal screamed. Sparks erupted. The impact crushed several Imperium soldiers caught in the hangar. The doors blasted open. Eric was already moving. Blaster in hand, he charged into the firestorm, his crew at his side. The Endbringer had been prepared to capture him. But not for this. Not for humanity's vengeance. The moment the boarding pod breached the Endbringer's hangar, hell erupted. The ship's security forces reacted fast, black-armored Imperium soldiers, their plasma rifles crackling with energy, moved in with precision, But they had expected prisoners, not an assault. That mistake cost them. Eric Talon was already firing before the hatch fully opened. His sidearm kicked against his palm, sending a burning bolt into the nearest alien's skull. The soldier's helmet cracked, the impact knocking him backward as his lifeless body hit the steel deck. Mara was next. She swept in low, rolling behind a cargo container as enemy fire streaked past her, scorching the walls. With a flick of her wrist, she lobbed a flash charge. The explosion of white-hot light disoriented the Imperium forces just long enough. Eric led the charge. He sprinted forward, his boots slamming against the deck, closing the distance before the enemy could recover. A blade hissed from his wrist sheath, human steel, sharp and unyielding. He drove it under an alien's jaw, twisted, and let the body fall. Behind him, the rest of the Vindication strike team poured into the hangar. Gunfire roared. Explosions shook the bay. The Imperium fought back with disciplined brutality, but they were staggered, caught off guard. A soldier lunged at Eric, a towering brute in Imperium combat plating, his strength unnatural. Eric ducked the first swing, then fired point-blank into the creature's gut. The shot barely slowed it. The second shot went into its eye. The alien crumpled, smoke rising from the melted socket. "Move!" Eric bellowed. "Secure the exits!" Mara's team pushed forward, clearing the control stations that overlooked the hangar. A crackle of static came over Eric's comm. "Commander!" Vren's voice, urgent, breathless. "You don't have much time." "Then talk fast," Eric snapped, kicking over a fallen rifle and grabbing it. His own sidearm was running low. "They're rerouting power to the blast doors," Vren said. "They're trying to trap you in." Eric cursed. Of course Zyricon wouldn't sit idle while his ship was breached. Mara's voice cut in. "We need to move now." "Where's the bridge?" "Forward decks," Vren answered. "But security's going to be heavier the closer you get. If you're going for the kill, you need another way in." Eric clenched his jaw. Time was against them. The longer they stayed here, the more reinforcements would close in. "Suggestions?" he asked. A pause. Then Vren's voice, hesitant. "There's a maintenance shaft that runs parallel to the command deck. It's not meant for access, but if you're willing to squeeze, we'll make it work," Eric said, already moving. "Send us the route." The crawl to the bridge. The access tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for a single person. Eric slid through first, his breath steady despite the suffocating space. Behind him, Mara followed, her voice low. "If we get stuck in here, I'm killing you first." Eric smirked, despite himself. "Noted." The metal walls vibrated faintly, distant echoes of alarms, movement, warships still exchanging fire outside. The Vindication was out there, buying them time, but it wouldn't last forever. Vren's voice guided them through the calm. "There should be an exit panel ahead. You're directly above the bridge." Eric reached the grate. He peered through the slats, seeing the dim glow of the command center below. And standing in the center, waiting, was Zyricon. The High Warlord was taller than any human, clad in war-etched armor that pulsed with energy. His crimson cloak barely moved, despite the ship's vibrations. Around him, officers worked feverishly, unaware that death loomed above them. Eric gripped the panel's edge. His muscles coiled. Then he dropped. The final duel. Eric landed hard, rolling as plasma fire erupted around him. His rifle snapped up, 3 quick bursts taking down the nearest Imperium officers. Mara hit the ground a second later, a knife already buried in an alien's throat. The bridge descended into chaos. Zyricon didn't move at first. He simply watched. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped forward. "You never knew when to die, Talon." The warlord's voice was deep, grating, filled with something almost amused. "A flaw in your species." Eric straightened, rifle aimed. "Flaws build civilizations." Zyricon's mouth curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Civilizations? No. Flaws build corpses." The warlord moved. Fast. Eric fired. The first shot went wide. The second sparked off Zyrakon's armor. Before he could get a third, the alien was on him. A crushing blow slammed into Eric's chest. He flew back, ribs screaming, breath punched from his lungs. Zyrakon loomed over him, raising a blade that pulsed with violet energy. Eric twisted, barely dodging as the weapon cleaved into the floor. The bridge shook. Consoles flickered. Eric rolled, grabbed a fallen plasma knife, and slashed upward. The blade met resistance, then sank into flesh. Zyrakon snarled, his left arm now dripping black blood. Mara fired from the side. The bolt struck his shoulder, staggering him. Eric didn't hesitate. He surged forward, ramming the knife deeper. Zyrakon seized his wrist, twisting brutally. Bones cracked. Eric gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. The warlord yanked him closer. "You fight well," he admitted. "But it ends here." Eric smirked. "You talk too much." Then he detonated the charge. A small, concealed explosive, strapped beneath his armor, ignited. The blast wasn't enough to kill Zyrakon, but it sent him flying backward, armor smoking, cloak aflame. Eric stumbled up, pain screaming through his body. He ignored it. Mara tossed him a rifle. "Finish it." Eric raised the weapon. Zyrakon pushed himself up, coughing, wounded but defiant. His black eyes burned with rage. Eric didn't give him the chance to speak. The shot hit center mass. The warlord staggered, a final breath escaping his lips. Then he fell. Silence. The bridge crew had already surrendered. Mara turned to Eric, breathing hard. "You good?" Eric wiped blood from his mouth. "I've been worse." A crackle over the comms. The Vindication. "Commander," the helmsman's voice. "The enemy fleet, some are retreating. The others, they're confused. The Endbringer is leaderless." Eric exhaled. They had done it. He looked out the viewport. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, humanity had struck back. And they weren't done. The corpse of High Warlord Zyrakon lay still, black blood pooling beneath his shattered armor. The bridge of the Endbringer was eerily silent. The Imperium officers who hadn't been killed in the firefight now stood frozen, hands raised in surrender. But Eric Talon didn't celebrate. He turned to the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, the battlefield remained a cauldron of chaos. The human fleet was battered, outnumbered, and on the edge of collapse. The Vindication fought tooth and nail, dodging volleys of plasma fire while trying to keep the remaining colony transports from being wiped out. Taking the bridge was only the first step. The war was still raging. Mara wiped blood from her cheek, breath ragged. "What's the play?" Eric's gaze swept the control panels. The dead Imperium officers slumped over their stations. He didn't hesitate. He stepped over Zyrakon's body and keyed into the command console. The alien text flickered under his touch, unreadable at first, until the ship's systems registered the High Warlord's biometric death and autologged in the highest-ranking presence aboard. "Let's see what toys they left us," Eric muttered. Mara crouched beside him, scanning the screens. "They still outgun us 10-1. But they're leaderless," Eric countered. "They're scared. Confused. We use that." A tactical display unfolded before them, a real-time map of the battlefield. Imperium ships still dominated the engagement, but without the Endbringer coordinating their attack, formations had begun to scatter. Some warships had already pulled back, awaiting new orders that wouldn't come. He pressed a command, opening the Imperium fleet-wide comms channel. A deep breath. Then he spoke. "This is Commander Eric Talon of the Vindication." His voice echoed across every ship in the enemy fleet. "Zyrakon is dead. Your flagship is ours." The channel crackled with static, stunned silence stretching out. Then an Imperium captain's voice came through, laced with disbelief. "Lies." Eric didn't answer with words. He stepped away from the console, hoisted Zyrakon's body by the shoulder, and let the warlord's lifeless form slump in front of the bridge's main holocom. This was your leader, Eric said coldly. Look at him. A ripple of panic transmissions followed. Confusion. Uncertainty. The Imperium was a war machine, built on absolute command structures. The death of a high warlord, especially one as feared as Zyricon, created a vacuum. And vacuums were dangerous. Mara leaned in, voice low. They're going to start tearing each other apart for power. Eric nodded. Let's speed that up. He switched to a direct broadcast aimed at the remaining fleet commanders. The next in command will want to prove themselves, he said, letting the words hang like a snare. This is your chance. Take control. Kill your rivals. Whoever wins the fight, I'll be waiting. Another moment of silence, then, all at once, the Imperium fleet turned against itself. A cruiser opened fire on its own escorts. A rival warlord's command ship, sensing weakness, launched an immediate attack on a fleet admiral's vessel. The chaos spread like a virus, turning what had been an overwhelming enemy force into a self-destructive maelstrom of infighting. Mara exhaled, half in disbelief. I can't believe that actually worked. They're not fighting for their empire, Eric said, watching the carnage unfold. They're fighting for power. He turned to her. That's the difference between them and us. The escape. With the Imperium tearing itself apart, the Vindication had its chance. Get me our fleet, Eric ordered. The comms crackled before the helmsman's voice came through. Commander! We thought you were dead. Not yet, Eric said. Get every remaining ship out of here, fast. Mara checked the scanners. We won't get another window like this. Eric looked back at Zyrocon's body one last time. Then he turned. We're leaving. The remaining Vindication strike team moved swiftly, planting explosives in key sections of the Endbringer's bridge before making their way back to the docking bay. The stolen Imperium boarding pod still had enough juice to get them out. As the pod detached, Eric watched through the viewport. The Endbringer remained motionless, its systems hijacked, its command structure severed. And then, one by one, the explosives detonated. Fire consumed the bridge. The Imperium flagship, once the symbol of their might, was reduced to a smoldering husk. Eric turned his gaze forward. The battle was done. But the war? Far from over. The aftermath. The surviving human fleet regrouped at a safe distance, battered but alive. The colony transports, still trailing damaged engines, had made it out. On the Vindication's bridge, Eric stood before the remaining officers. Faces streaked with sweat and soot, uniforms torn, bodies aching, but alive. Mara leaned against the console, shaking her head. I still don't know how we pulled that off. Eric crossed his arms. We did what humans do best. Mara arched a brow. And what's that? He gave a tired smirk. Survive. A quiet chuckle spread through the bridge. Not joyous. Not triumphant. Just relief. Then the mood shifted. The weight of what came next settled over them. What now? One of the officers asked. We won today, but they'll be back. Eric's smirk faded. He knew the Imperium wouldn't forget this. They would come for vengeance. And humanity would have to be ready. But they had proven something today, something the Imperium would never forget. They weren't prey. They weren't broken. And they weren't done fighting. Eric turned toward the viewport, watching the remains of the battlefield drift through space. The war isn't over, he said. But today, we reminded them of one thing. Mara stepped beside him, gaze steady. And what's that? Eric exhaled. That humanity doesn't kneel. Outside, the stars burned bright. The war waited. And humanity was ready.